Hello, I'm Corrine Maury. I'm from Nelson. I am a terminated registered nurse that has been barred from practicing in the province of BC for the last 2.5 years. We've had a recent rescinding of the mandates for healthcare workers, and there are many that are requesting some clarification on what just happened and what we should be doing next. So I'm going to be providing a bit of a summary here. I am going to read most of it because it is quite detailed, and I apologize if it goes on at length, but honestly, to me, this is history. And for all of those who want to understand how this kind of mandate was enforced, this is just one piece of the puzzle, but it would be useful for you to understand it. So here we go. I am part of a team of nurses who have self-organized, and we have been actively investigating and demanding accountability from the BC Nurses Union. We are concerned about an apparent conflict of interest between the BC NDP government and the BC Nurses Union. Substantial taxpayer funds have been transferred to a union that they should be holding to account. Actually, let me repeat that. Substantial taxpayer funds have been transferred to a union that should be holding the government to account. Despite these funds, there have been no tangible improvements or solutions to existing healthcare problems. And further, this flow of taxpayer money has reduced the incentive of the BC Nurses Union to effectively represent its members. BC was the only province in Canada to maintain the enforcement of these mandates, infringing on the legally protected individual autonomy, compromising the ethical standards required of healthcare professionals, and finally, contributing to the collapse of our public healthcare system, especially in rural BC. Recently, I have been in discussions with rural BC mayors whose communities have been increasingly affected by the emerge closures that have been happening due to staffing shortages. This subsequently also severely impacted the provision of healthcare service in general to these communities. In my discussions with these elected officials, I discovered that they were not actually aware of how many players were involved in the enforcement of these mandates and of the significant financial transactions that were flowing between the BC NDP government and the BC Nurses Union. We formally request a BC Auditor General investigation into these payments, as there are concerns that public taxpayer money is not being used for its intended purpose. And I will be forwarding along the accompanying documentation to every elected official in this province so that this can be reviewed. After 2.5 years, on July 26th, Bonnie Henry rescinded the vaccine mandates for healthcare workers. While this might seem like a victory, we caution against that assumption. The BC NDP continues to act as if the law does not apply to them. And additionally, there are now new requirements for further disclosure of personal medical information that raise concerns. Affected workers are still being mistreated, and these new measures could actually be part of a larger strategy to erode our rights further. To understand the situation, it's important to know how unions in BC work. They were created to protect employees, but their operational structure actually creates a high risk for corruption. In Canada, unions are nonprofit and as a result do not have to pay or file for income taxes, nor is there any requirement for transparent financial reporting. Audited financial statements only ensure that a financial reporting conforms to a specific reporting standard. It does not verify that the financial transactions are actually accurate. The only financial audit that will verify that the money flow is accurate is a forensic audit. Canada is one of the only countries where union membership is mandatory. Dues are deducted from paychecks before employees even see their earnings. For nurses, this is 2% of regular pay. This ensures a guaranteed customer base for unions and removes any incentive to actually perform its job duties, as it gets paid whether it does its job or not. Unionized workers are governed by the collective agreement, which is only effective if the union actually enforces it. Any complaints against the union are submitted through the BC Labour Board, not the courts. Once you become a union member, you lose your individual legal rights. They are then transferred to the union for any workplace issue. You can no longer protect yourself. Conflicts are handled through a union-controlled grievance process, and it is up to the union if it decides whether it's going to represent you or not. There are 3 steps involved in this grievance process. The last one is including an arbitrator. So let's talk about the players in this story, because it wasn't just Bonnie Henry. We have Adrian Dix, the Minister of Health. We have HEA-BC, who is the Health Employers Association of BC. They oversee the health authorities, the BC Nurses Union, and affected nurses. Here's just a few facts for you. Bonnie Henry's public health order did not state that healthcare workers had to be terminated, only that we could not work. Other regions used temporary leaves of absence and then returned workers back. In BC, it was HEA-BC, the employer, that directed health authorities to terminate those who did not comply with mandatory vaccination. This violated the healthcare professionals' responsibility to protect individual autonomy in medical decisions. If you remove ethical standards from a healthcare system, you undermine all of the respect and protections that should be available to each individual patient. The terminations also violated this collective agreement. And we also had policies already implemented that stated that nurses would not ever be disciplined for not taking an influenza vaccine. The BC Nurses Union should have immediately acted to protect nurses, and it did not. In fact, everyone went on leave. The president resigned, and I am going to mention publicly that we do have a recorded interview with her on file for whenever we need to go to court. Just put that out there. After the terminations, we filed Freedom of Information requests, and we discovered that in the 6 months after terminations, there were over 20,000 COVID sick calls from double vaccinated staff in just 4 health authorities. As it became obvious that the vaccines were not effective, by August 2022, health authorities' infection control sent out communications to staff stating that COVID was now normalized and clumped into all the other viruses out there. Staff were told that even if they were COVID positive, they were to come to work. Critical staffing shortages were filled by travel agency nurses, private contractors who are non-unionized. BCNU allowed these non-unionized nurses into the workplace where they were actually paid more than the unionized nurses. Hospitals are now dependent on agency nurses, costing taxpayers significantly more. Agency nurses are at least 4 times the amount of regular employees. They get higher pay, their accommodation and travel is covered, and the agency has fees that also have to be covered. The use of agency nurses increased by 250%, demonstrating poor financial management of our taxpayer money. We then discovered that this union was receiving substantial taxpayer money again from the Ministry of Health. Again, as the union's role is to hold the government to account, How is it possible to take hundreds of millions of dollars from the very source that you are to hold to account? I would say this is a conflict of interest. Last year, BCNU received $100 million from the BC Ministry of Health. And in order to receive that money, they had to ensure that members voted in favor of the collective agreement that was bargained last March. Union members were not told that the union was going to receive money if the members voted in favor of this agreement. There was a lot of coercion, but they made it happen. This money then was to be designated for a nurse benefit fund. And just so you know, as of December 31st, 2023, $0 of that fund had actually been dispersed to nurses. There is a memorandum of understanding, and this is very important. This is a legal agreement between the Ministry of Health and BCNU that establishes annual payments. Last year, $200 million was given. This year, $250 million was paid. And next year, starting annually, the union will receive $300 million of taxpayer money. That's almost $850 million over 3 years. I bet you some of our communities could get a few more long-term beds with that money. Statements from BCNU inform the public that the union is enforcing nurse-patient ratios, which have actually been in place for decades. And what our current system actually needs is nurses. Pre-pandemic, there were 2,000 empty nursing lines, and there are currently over 5,000. Despite the union getting these funds, there is no plan in place to actually provide the nurses that are needed to sustain these nurse-patient ratios. And there really is no justification as to why the union needs $250 million to ensure this. I will also note that there is quite a bit of effort trying to bring in international nurses. Just so you know, taxpayers are paying for those licensing fees, and the BC College of Nurses has let us know that they are expediting these applications through, even though they admit they have never had so many fraudulent applications. There is also another fund that we need to look at, and it's called a retiree benefits fund. And this was sold to nurses that 1% of all of their wages would be paid by the Ministry of Health to the union to be collected to provide post-retirement benefits to retired nurses. In the last 5 years, less than $5 million has been dispersed. Would you like to know how much money is in that fund? $500 million. In the negotiated contract between the Ministry of Health and BCNU, it actually states that nurses are not guaranteed to receive this money. Eligible retirees have no right, title, or interest in or to the assets of the retiree benefit fund. In a Freedom of Information request that's dated November 26, 2018, Adrian Dix met with BCNU, and they agreed to collect data to assess a way to utilize these retiree benefits funds because they are not being used for their intended purpose. Again, the reason why I am highlighting this is because right now our government is coming to us for every single cent we have. And it is being leaked out to entities that have no responsibility to disclose where this money is going, nor to use it for its intended purpose. And I will let you know this is only one of a few examples that I know of. And so I just want to bring this up because it is important for us to realize how much our resources are being misused and administrated in a way that I will just say is unethical. With the BC provincial election scheduled for October 19th, both the Conservative BC and the BC United parties have promised to reinstate the terminated healthcare workers. We actually believe that the BC NDP rescinded these mandates as a political strategy decision, not a health decision, because the BC NDP is losing so much public support. However, I do want to state to the political parties to be aware that there are closed-door negotiations going on behind the scenes, and these settlements could actually potentially limit your future actions. So I would caution you against promising things that you may not actually have any control over because of what's going on behind these closed doors. I just want to leave that, okay? Terminated nurses have been waiting a year for the arbitration, which occurred in March of this last year. Jackie DeGuayo signed both a process and a consent order in May, supporting a settlement that went on between BCNU and HEABC. The simple version, because it's several pages long, was this. If the public health order is rescinded by January 31st, 2025, terminated nurses can be rehired with the reinstatement of their service, seniority, and banks that were not paid out at termination. There is no appeal process. If, however, the public health order is not rescinded by January 31st, 2025, and is instead rescinded by March 31st, 2025, it's up to the health authorities if they hire nurses back. As this was released June 6th, 2024, we immediately constructed a complaint against the union, which will be filed shortly. There are a few things that I want to highlight in this settlement. First one, union members should have equal rights to the benefits of negotiated settlements. The only members that this settlement addressed were those nurses who are in a position to go back to work in a BC healthcare setting. We have had substantial numbers of nurses relocate to other provinces in order to be able to work, and they will not be returning to a BC job. We have another group of nurses who experienced abusive treatment in the workplace and also will not return to a BC job. However, under the labor law, every single one of these nurses is entitled to severance, pension top-ups, loss of benefits, vacation, and injury to dignity. This settlement, in my opinion, is a bastard settlement. Certain nurses are treated as if their status is one outside of the family, and they are not entitled to the same rights and benefits as those inside the family. This settlement was clearly constructed to accommodate whoever ended up being in provincial power after this upcoming election by opening a doorway where the option to postpone the rescinding of the public health order, it provided a mechanism where the provincial government could, again, deny legally entitled obligations by delaying the rescinding. This provides a clear example of how governments apply laws to others, yet do not hold themselves accountable to the same processes. This is interesting because if the government is not made to follow the law, then very simply, we live in a lawless society. I can hear you say, okay, but the mandates were rescinded, so now what does that mean? We're down to 2 pages. The direction to reapply for work is not an appropriate settlement, as per my bastard comparison. There's an added element now. Employees, contractors, contracted facilities, which would be private long-term care facilities, allied healthcare professionals, volunteers will now undergo mandatory reporting, which comes into effect July 26th, yesterday. Everyone must report their immunization for COVID-19 and other influenza and their immune status for other critical vaccine preventable diseases. Collecting these records will allow for quick action in the event of an exposure, outbreak, or future pandemic to ensure healthcare workers who are not immune follow appropriate measures. Depending on the circumstances, this could include masking, modified duties, or exclusion from work. Immunization remains the single best way to protect. Well, immunization is the only way to protect. Immunization does not equal vaccination. Immunization can come from natural immunity. Then this data will be collected and stored in a BC registry. I have two questions that initially popped up. And one is, how will this data be updated regularly? In order to find out your immunization levels, this requires blood work. So are they going to be requiring blood work from everyone? How often? How many times is this going to be collected? How will this process be implemented? If Adrian Dix is requiring every person that is associated with healthcare, even volunteers, to undergo regular blood work for biological data to be registered in a provincial registry, I question the motivation behind this. I'm suspicious. So what now? Nurses will be submitting a complaint to the Labor Board for failure of duty and fair representation. Our documentation is at the lawyers right now for review, and we will be submitting this shortly. We are hoping that if there is any ethical arbitrators left in our system, that this will lead to some kind of correction, review, and hopefully, maybe even one day, an investigation from the BC Auditor General into the financial transactions that are occurring. This is important. Please listen up. I will not give advice to individual healthcare workers as to whether you should apply for work or not. This is a personal decision. I will, however, submit an analogy, which is these mandates could have been stopped because of a united resistance to coercion. And we are here because there wasn't. If only some of our members are provided relief while the rest of the group is ignored, is that our solution? The terms of the settlement give you 6 months to reapply. We are also in an election year where there still could be significant changes in the provincial government. I myself am currently running in the Kootenay Central riding as an independent, and I chose to go independent as I cannot risk being compromised by party politics when my whole being is directed to do whatever is necessary to protect our people. And this would include exposing public abuse by governments. I do want to highlight our history of how the Japanese were identified as a threat to the public. And they were rounded up and interned, which means to be confined, and their assets removed. And there was hatred directed towards them. And it took 40 years for restitution. We have the Doukhobor community whose children were taken from them because they wouldn't put them in a public school system. There has been no compensation to them. We still have issues with First Nations that have not been resolved. We have a pattern with our provincial government of abusing people and then not fulfilling its obligation of restitution. The only way that we will start to see a change is if we start to put ethical people into places of leadership. And we need to take a little bit more responsibility in who we are choosing to put into those places of leadership. Solutions. Legally, the law needs to be changed. Union membership must be made voluntary rather than mandatory to ensure accountability. We currently have at least over 40% of the workforce in this province under a union. That means that if unions collude at all with the government, it is very easy to enforce things in the workplace with no protection. Unions should not be able to operate under a nonprofit umbrella. They should not be able to take government money. And they should have to undergo scheduled forensic audits if they are holding any funds that are intended for a specific purpose. We need an investigation by the BC Auditor General into the financial transfers from the BC NDP to BCNU. And we want a very detailed accounting of where that money is. If the money is not being used for its intended purpose, then the money flow from the public needs to stop. BCNU needs to actually transfer our representation to our own legal counsel. I could probably do a much better job than what they're pulling off. Because actually, here's another idea. Because the BC Nurses Union actually actively participated in delaying representation for nurses, which then contributed to healthcare collapse in rural areas due to the staffing shortages, it might be worth looking at that as the public, we should do legal action against BC Nurses Union. We as members cannot initiate it, but as members of the public, I'm thinking we might have a shot here. And then the last thing, when Dix and Henry are fired, they should receive the same treatment that we all experienced. Okay, hope that helped. That will hopefully stop all of the emails and messages coming to me. However, if you do need some more information, you can contact me at stopmannow.gmail. I'll put it up. And I guess we're going to see what happens next. Okay, thanks. Bye.